David Cole stood tall on the battle-scarred ground, his heart racing from the fight. The air was thick with smoke, the remnants of a fierce battle that had lasted for days. The war against the Karak, a fierce alien race, had reached its peak with this final confrontation. David, a soldier with a deep sense of duty but little love for war, had just slain the Karak warlord, Chathraga, in a brutal one-on-one duel. The creature's massive body lay sprawled on the ground, blood oozing from the wound David had delivered. For a moment, there was silence. The Karak warriors around them stood still, their eyes locked on their fallen leader. It was the moment of truth. Would they surrender, or would they fight to the last? David's breath came in shallow gasps, his hand shaking slightly from the intensity of the battle. His mind raced, but all he could focus on was the form of Chathraga lying in the dirt. The Karak were a warrior race, bound by strict codes of honor. David knew they respected strength above all else. Killing the warlord should have been enough to end the conflict, but he knew better. The Karak always had a price. As if on cue, an elder Karak stepped forward. This one was old, his body thinner than the others. But his eyes were sharp, and his posture spoke of a lifetime of battles. He raised his hands, and the warriors around them lowered their weapons. "The warlord is dead," the elder's voice rang out in the tense silence. "But this war is not yet over. The one who slays our leader must take his place in every way. By ancient law, he who kills Chathraga must inherit his responsibility, his title, and his wives." David's mind went blank. He stared at the elder, his heart pounding in his chest. Wives. The Karak had a strange culture, one David had heard about, but never thought would involve him. The idea of taking a wife was foreign to him, let alone 3. And these were no ordinary women. They were Chathraga's wives, each powerful and influential in their own right. He tried to speak, but the words didn't come. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. "What do you mean, his wives?" He finally managed, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. The elder's gaze softened, but his words remained firm. "By the law of the Karak, no leader stands alone. You are the new leader now. You must take his wives to rule with strength and wisdom. They are bound to the leader. If you refuse, it will be seen as an insult, and war will continue. The people will never follow a weak leader." David's thoughts were a whirlwind. He had come to this world with the hope that killing Chathraga would finally bring peace, but now he was trapped in a web of alien traditions that he barely understood. He glanced at the 3 women who stood behind the elder. They were powerful figures in their own right, each a member of the Karak elite, each respected and feared by their people. Viraka was the first wife, her body tall and strong, her posture one of authority. Her face was hard, her eyes cold, like a warrior who had fought for everything she had. She watched him with a look of disdain, as if sizing him up and finding him wanting. Her reputation as a skilled fighter and strategist was well known, and David could already tell that she wouldn't be pleased with this turn of events. Next was Shaniri, the second wife. She was different from Viraka. Where Viraka was sharp and stern, Shaniri had a calculating look, as if she were constantly plotting the next move in a game of war. Her eyes never left David, but there was something in her gaze that hinted at a sharp intelligence, perhaps even curiosity. David knew that Shaniri was a master of strategy and diplomacy. She would be a force to reckon with in the days to come. And then there was Kalatesh, the third wife. She was the quiet one, standing slightly apart from the others. Her expression was unreadable, her eyes soft but distant. Kalatesh was the diplomat of the trio, a woman who had been known to broker peace deals between factions that seemed beyond reconciliation. If anyone could help him navigate this bizarre situation, it was her. David looked at each of them in turn. He didn't know what to say or how to act. The weight of the situation pressed down on him. He had thought the war was over, but now it seemed that his real battle was just beginning. "I didn't come here for this," he said finally, his voice more to himself than to anyone in particular. He turned back to the elder, frustration seeping into his tone. I came here to end the war, to save lives. I didn't come here to be some ruler. And I definitely didn't come here to take anyone's wives. The elder's eyes narrowed slightly. That may be true, human, but the law is clear. If you wish to avoid bloodshed, you must accept the responsibility. The Karak will not bow to a leader who cannot take what is his by right. Refuse, and the war will continue. Accept, and you will be their new leader. David stood there in silence, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. He hadn't asked for any of this. But the choice seemed clear. If he refused, he would be responsible for reigniting a war that had already cost so many lives. And yet the idea of taking Chathraga's wives, women who were as formidable as they were alien, seemed absurd. But the Karak were a proud people, and David knew that pride was something they would fight to protect. If he didn't take on this role, the peace he had fought so hard for might slip through his fingers. David took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the handle of his weapon. He glanced once more at the three women behind the elder, his mind made up. He would do what was necessary to stop the war. Fine, he said, his voice firm despite the uncertainty in his chest. I'll do it, but don't think for a second that this will be easy. The elder nodded, a slight smile forming on his ancient face. It is never easy, human. But it is the way of the Karak. David Cole sat in the large ceremonial hall, feeling more like a prisoner than a victorious warrior. The Karak had spared no effort in preparing for the official ceremony that would make him their leader. Massive stone pillars lined the room, torches flickering along the walls, casting long shadows on the ancient carvings of past warlords. The weight of tradition pressed down on him like a mountain. Across the room, the three wives of Chathraga stood in silence. Their expressions were unreadable, but David could feel the tension in the air. None of them wanted this any more than he did. The eldest Karak elder, the same one who had declared the ancient law, stepped forward. His deep voice echoed through the chamber. The time has come. The bond must be sealed. The warlord has fallen. A new leader must rise. The wives of Chathraga shall stand beside him. David exhaled slowly. He had spent the last few hours trying to think of a way out of this, but there was none. If he refused, the Karak would see it as an insult, one that could lead to more fighting. He had no choice but to go through with it. The first to step forward was Veraka, the warrior wife. Her sharp eyes met David's, and he could see the anger burning inside them. She was taller than him, her muscular frame built for combat. Her dark armor gleamed under the torchlight, and her sharp claws tapped against the stone floor as she moved. "This is a mistake," she muttered under her breath, her voice filled with frustration. "A human leading the Karak. It is an insult to everything we stand for." David sighed. "You think I asked for this?" Veraka scoffed, but said nothing more. She simply stood beside him, arms crossed, refusing to look in his direction. The second wife, Shaniri, approached next. She was different from Veraka, more composed, more calculating. Her long robes swayed as she walked, and her piercing golden eyes studied David carefully, as if he were a puzzle she was trying to solve. "Interesting," she murmured, tilting her head slightly. "You do not act like a warrior, yet you defeated one of the strongest warlords in our history. There is more to you than meets the eye." David gave a tired smile. "I'd like to think so." She did not return the smile, but she nodded slightly, as if acknowledging something unspoken. Then she stood beside Veraka, still watching him with quiet curiosity. The last to step forward was Kalatesh, the diplomat wife. She was the most reserved of the three, her expression calm and unreadable. Unlike the others, she did not show any open hostility, nor did she seem particularly interested in him. She simply met his gaze and gave a small nod before taking her place. The elder raised his hands. "It is done. The wives have accepted their new warlord. The Karak will follow him. A loud cheer erupted from the warriors gathered outside the hall, but inside, the silence between David and his new wives was heavy. He could feel their unspoken thoughts, their resentment, their uncertainty. David rubbed his temple. "Look, I don't expect any of you to like this. I sure don't. But if this is what it takes to keep the peace, then fine. I'll do it. But let's make one thing clear. I'm not here to control anyone. I just want to stop more bloodshed." Varaka scoffed. "A leader who does not lead. Pathetic." Shaniri smirked slightly. "No, Varaka. He is a different kind of leader, one we do not yet understand." Kalatesh finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. "The Karak do not change easily, but change always comes. Perhaps this is a new path." David looked at each of them, realizing that this was only the beginning of his problems. He wasn't just dealing with 3 powerful women. He was dealing with the entire Karak way of life, and they were watching his every move. Later that night, the ceremony had ended, and David was given his own chamber in the fortress-like palace of the warlord. He sat by the large stone window, staring out at the Karak city below. Fires burned in the distance, warriors celebrating their new leader. He had never felt so out of place in his life. A knock on the heavy metal door made him turn. It was Shaniri. She stepped inside, moving with quiet grace. "You cannot sleep," she observed. David shook his head. "Too much to think about." She studied him for a moment before stepping closer. "You surprise me, human. Most warriors who take the throne are eager to rule. You do not seem eager for anything." David gave a short laugh. "I didn't come here to rule. I came here to stop a war. Now I'm married to 3 women who probably want to throw me off a cliff." Shaniri smirked slightly. "Only Varaka wants to throw you off a cliff. Kalatesh is undecided." David sighed. "That's comforting." She tilted her head. "Perhaps this will not be as bad as you think. You defeated Chatharaga not just with strength, but with intelligence. That is rare among the Karak. It may be the reason you succeed where others have failed." David frowned. "You don't sound as angry about this as Varaka." Shaniri chuckled. "I do not let emotions rule me. I see potential where others see obstacles." David leaned back against the stone wall. "Well, let's hope that potential doesn't get me killed." Shaniri studied him for a moment longer before turning to leave. "Rest well, human. Tomorrow, you begin learning what it truly means to be a warlord." As the door closed behind her, David sighed, running a hand through his hair. He had survived countless battles, fought against impossible odds, and faced death more times than he could count. But this might be his hardest battle yet. David Cole woke to the sound of heavy footsteps outside his chamber. The first rays of sunlight streamed through the high stone windows, casting a golden glow on the rough walls. He had barely slept, his mind filled with endless thoughts about his new role. Before he could fully wake up, a deep voice called from the other side of the door. "The new warlord must rise. The trial begins." David groaned, rubbing his face. "Trial? What trial?" The door swung open, and Varaka stepped inside. She was already in full battle armor, her sharp eyes filled with impatience. Every warlord must prove their strength to the Karak. "You may have killed Chatharaga, but that does not mean you are accepted." David sighed. "Of course, because killing the last guy wasn't enough." Varaka folded her arms. "If you are weak, they will not follow you. And if they do not follow you, the peace you seek will be nothing but an empty dream." David knew she was right. The Karak were warriors. They didn't just take orders. They followed strength. If he wanted them to listen, he had to earn their respect. The arena. David was led to a massive stone arena at the center of the Karak city. Hundreds of warriors surrounded the fighting pit, chanting and pounding their weapons against the ground. The air smelled of sweat, smoke, and dust. At the far end of the arena, Shaniri and Kalatesh, stood on a high platform, watching. Veraka remained beside David, her arms crossed. "Your trial is simple," she said. "You will face 3 warriors. If you survive, the Karak will accept you as warlord. If you fall," she smirked slightly, "then you were never worthy." David exhaled sharply. He had fought plenty of battles before, but this was different. This wasn't just about winning. It was about proving himself to an entire species. The first warrior stepped forward. He was massive, even for a Karak, with thick armor and a large war axe. The crowd roared as he raised his weapon. "He is strong," Veraka said, "but slow. Use that." David nodded. He had no armor, only the light clothing given to him after the ceremony. He needed to be quick. The warrior charged, swinging his axe in a wide arc. David ducked just in time, feeling the wind from the heavy blade rush past his head. He rolled to the side, grabbing a loose stone from the ground and hurling it at the warrior's head. The Karak stumbled for a second, just enough time for David to strike. He rushed forward, using his smaller size to get inside the warrior's reach. With one quick move, he drove his fist into the warrior's throat. The Karak choked, dropping his weapon. David wasted no time. He grabbed the axe and swung it with all his strength, striking the warrior's leg. The Karak collapsed, groaning in pain. The crowd went silent for a moment, then erupted in cheers. One down. David dropped the axe and turned as the second warrior entered the arena. This one was leaner, faster. He wielded 2 short blades, his eyes sharp and focused. David took a deep breath. This would be harder. The warrior moved first, his blades flashing. David barely dodged in time, feeling the air cut against his skin. He couldn't afford to stay on the defensive. He feinted left, then spun right, kicking up dust to blind his opponent. The Karak hesitated, and David took his chance. He lunged, grabbing the warrior's wrist and twisting hard. The blade clattered to the ground. But the warrior was fast, too fast. His other blade sliced across David's arm. Pain flared through his body, but he gritted his teeth and didn't let go. With all his strength, he used his injured arm to push the warrior backward, then slammed his elbow into the Karak's head. The warrior crumpled. The crowd roared again. David staggered back, breathing heavily. Blood dripped from his arm, but he didn't have time to worry about it. The third opponent stepped forward. This one was different. He carried no weapons, only a long staff. His stance was calm, almost relaxed. David frowned. Something felt off. The warrior suddenly moved, faster than David had expected. The staff struck out like a whip, cracking against David's ribs. Pain exploded in his chest, and he stumbled back. The warrior didn't stop. Another strike came, this time at David's legs. He barely jumped in time, but his balance was off. David hit the ground hard. The crowd gasped. Veraka's voice rang in his head. "If you are weak, they will not follow you." David gritted his teeth. "I am not weak." As the warrior closed in for the final blow, David acted. He rolled to the side, grabbing a handful of dirt and throwing it into the warrior's eyes. The Karak flinched, momentarily blinded. David didn't hesitate. He surged forward, slamming his fist into the warrior's chest. He felt the impact vibrate through his arm, but he didn't stop. He struck again and again until the warrior collapsed. Silence. Then, an explosion of cheers. David stood, breathing heavily, blood dripping down his arm. He looked up at the Karak elders, then at the 3 wives standing on the platform. Shanire gave a small, approving nod. Kalatesh watched with quiet curiosity. Veraka, she smirked. Not bad, human. David wiped sweat from his brow. Glad you approve. The elder stepped forward. The trial is complete. The warlord has proven his strength. The Karak warriors pounded their weapons against the ground in unison, a deep rhythmic sound. It was a sign of respect. David exhaled. He had survived, but he knew this was just the beginning. Because being accepted was one thing, leading them would be another battle entirely. David Cole sat in the great warlord's hall, his body aching from the trial. The cheers of the Karak warriors still echoed in his mind. But now, in the silence of the stone chamber, the reality of his situation felt heavier than ever. He had proven himself in combat, but that was just the beginning. Leadership wasn't only about fighting. It was about ruling, commanding, making decisions that would affect thousands of lives. And that was something he had never wanted. Across the room, Shan'iri, Kalatesh, and Veraka sat on high stone chairs, watching him. Their expressions were unreadable. Finally, Kalatesh, the diplomat, broke the silence. "You have passed the trial. The warriors accept you." David sighed, rubbing his temple. "Great. So what happens now?" Veraka leaned forward, her sharp eyes locking onto his. "Now you lead." David shook his head. "I don't know your ways. I don't know your traditions. I don't even know what you expect from me." Shan'iri tilted her head. "Then you must learn quickly." David exhaled slowly. "Fine. Then teach me." The first lesson. The next morning, David stood on the high balcony of the warlord's fortress, looking down at the Karak city. Warriors marched through the streets. Traders shouted in the marketplace, and massive stone buildings stretched toward the sky. "This is your kingdom now," Shan'iri said beside him. David turned to her. "It doesn't feel like mine." She gave a small smile. "Because you do not yet understand it. Come." She led him through the fortress, down into the heart of the city. Warriors and civilians alike stopped to stare as they passed. Some bowed their heads in respect. Others whispered to each other, unsure of what to think about their new human leader. David ignored the stares and focused on Shan'iri. "Tell me about the Karak. Not just the warriors, but the people." Shan'iri nodded. "The Karak value strength, but strength is not only in battle. It is in wisdom, in unity, in survival. Our people are divided into clans, each with its own role." She gestured toward a group of heavily armored warriors. "The Bloodclaw warriors protect the city and fight in wars." Then, she pointed to a large building where Karak in white robes moved between tables covered in glowing crystals and metal tools. "The forge cased builds our weapons and technology." Finally, she led him to a quieter district where Karak in dark robes sat in circles, discussing something in hushed voices. "The shadow speakers. They are our spies, our informants. They see the future, predict dangers." David took it all in. "And I'm supposed to rule over all of them." Shan'iri nodded. "Yes, and they will follow you, if you give them a reason to." David sighed. "What if I fail?" Shan'iri met his eyes. "Then we all fall with you." An unwanted challenge. Just as David was beginning to process everything, a deep voice rang through the streets. "I challenge the warlord." The crowd fell silent. David turned to see a massive Karak warrior step forward. His armor was painted red with war symbols, and his eyes burned with fury. Veraka appeared beside David, her expression dark. "This is Torvas, one of Chathraga's greatest champions." David sighed. "Of course he is." Torvas pounded his chest. "A weak human cannot rule us. You got lucky in your trial. Now, face a true warrior." The crowd murmured, waiting for David's response. Kalatesh whispered, "You cannot refuse. A warlord must always answer a challenge." David clenched his fists. He had barely recovered from the trial, and now he had to fight again. He stepped forward, locking eyes with Torvas. "Fine, let's get this over with." The duel. The fight took place in the center of the city, in a smaller battle ring surrounded by Karak warriors. Torvas grinned as he cracked his knuckles. "I will end this quickly, human." David rolled his shoulders. "You can try." The fight began, and Torvas lunged. He was faster than David expected. far faster than the warriors in the trial. David barely dodged the first punch, but the second one caught him in the ribs. Pain exploded through his side, and he staggered back. Torvas didn't stop. He pressed forward, swinging his massive fists like hammers. David knew he couldn't match the Kerek's raw strength. He had to be smarter. As Torvas threw another punch, David ducked low and kicked his opponent's knee. The warrior stumbled, and David took the chance to land a solid strike to his ribs. But Torvas recovered quickly. He grabbed David's arm and threw him across the ring. David hit the ground hard, coughing. The crowd watched in silence. Torvas laughed. "This is your warlord. Weak." David wiped blood from his lip and slowly stood. His body ached, but he wasn't done yet. "Weak?" he smirked. "Then why are you breathing so hard?" Torvas frowned, realizing that David had barely been hit, yet he was moving faster, dodging more. The Kerek warrior was strong, but he was burning his energy too quickly. David knew what to do. He kept moving, dodging, letting Torvas waste his strength. The warrior grew frustrated, swinging wildly. His punches slowed. Then David struck. A quick jab to the throat, a kick to the ribs, a final punch to the jaw. Torvas collapsed. The crowd erupted. David stood over his fallen opponent, breathing heavily. "Are we done now?" Viraka smirked. "For now." Kalatesh nodded in approval. "You fight with patience. That is rare among the Kerek." Torvas groaned but raised a fist in respect. "You are stronger than I thought, human." David exhaled, shaking his head. "I really need a break." The Kerek warriors cheered. David had won again. But deep down, he knew that being warlord was not about winning fights. The real battle was just beginning. David Cole sat in the warlord's hall, his fingers drumming on the stone table. The torches flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. His mind was restless. The rebellion within the city had been crushed. Torvas had been defeated, but peace never lasted long. Across the table, Shan-Iri, Kalatesh, and Viraka sat, their expressions serious. They knew what was coming. Shan-Iri was the first to speak. "Scouts have returned. The enemy is moving." David frowned. "Who?" Kalatesh unfolded a map and pointed to the western mountains. "The Draxol." David had heard the name before. The Draxol were another powerful alien race, rivals of the Kerek. But unlike the Kerek, who valued strength in warriors, the Draxol were conquerors. They believed in overwhelming their enemies with sheer numbers and firepower. Viraka crossed her arms. "They think we are weak after Chathraga's death. They are preparing to attack." David leaned forward. "How long do we have?" Shan-Iri's voice was grim. "A week. Maybe less. A leader's burden." David walked through the fortress, his mind racing. He had been forced into this role, but now his decisions would decide the fate of the Kerek people. As he passed through the training grounds, warriors stopped to salute him. Some looked at him with respect, others with doubt. Viraka walked beside him. "The warriors are ready, but they still wonder if you are the right leader." David smirked. "Then I guess I'll have to prove them wrong." Viraka nodded. "We need a strategy. The Draxol have more soldiers, more weapons. If we fight them in open battle, we will lose." David looked up at the fortress walls, then at the city beyond. He had studied military history on Earth. Wars fought by humans, battles won against impossible odds. And an idea began to form. "We won't fight them in open battle," David said. "We'll make them fight on our terms." The plan. That night, David gathered the war council. Maps covered the table, and warriors surrounded him, waiting for his orders. David pointed to the western mountains. "The Draxol will come through this pass. It is the fastest route." Kalatesh nodded. "But they know we will expect them there. They might try another way." David smiled. "Exactly. which is why we will make them believe we are waiting in the wrong place. Scifi raised an eyebrow. Explain. David moved a small wooden figure on the map. We make it look like our forces are gathering at the northern border. We send scouts there. Let them see movement. Let them believe we are preparing to defend that area. Varaka grinned, and when they take the bait, David tapped the western pass. We ambush them here. The warriors murmured in approval. It was a bold plan, risky, but clever. Kalatesh smiled. You think like a warlord. David shook his head. No, I think like a human. Preparing for war. The next days were spent preparing. Warriors trained harder. Weapons were sharpened. Traps were set in the western pass. Hidden explosives, collapsing rock formations, everything they could use to turn the battlefield in their favor. David worked alongside the warriors, showing them new tactics, new ways to fight. He taught them how to move in smaller units, how to use speed against the enemy's numbers. Varaka watched him closely. You fight differently than us. David wiped sweat from his forehead. Humans have always had to fight smarter. We've never been the strongest. We've never been the fastest. But we adapt. And that's how we survive. Varaka nodded. Then let's see if your way works. The enemy arrives. On the 6th day, the scouts returned with urgent news. The Draxel army is moving. They took the bait. David felt a surge of relief. The plan was working. But then, another scout arrived, his face pale. There is more. They are not alone. David's stomach tightened. What do you mean? The scout hesitated. The Draxel have brought war machines, tanks, aerial drones. More than we expected. A heavy silence filled the room. Kalatesh's voice was quiet. We might be outmatched. David clenched his fists. No, we just need to adjust. He looked at the map again, thinking fast. Change the traps. We need to target their war machines first. If we take them out, we can force the battle into close combat. Varaka nodded. I will make sure of it. David exhaled. Then we hold our ground, no matter what. The first strike. As the sun set, the Karak warriors took their positions in the western pass. Hidden among the rocks and trenches, they waited. David stood at the front, gripping his weapon tightly. Then they heard it. A deep, rumbling sound. The ground trembled as the Draxel army marched forward. David saw the massive machines rolling toward them, their metal bodies gleaming under the fading light. Soldiers marched behind them, thousands of them. It was a terrifying sight, but David didn't let fear control him. He raised his hand. Wait, wait. The Draxel moved closer, closer. Now, the night exploded in fire. Traps detonated, sending shockwaves through the enemy ranks. Boulders crashed down from the mountains, crushing tanks. Explosives ripped through the air, destroying drones before they could fire. The Draxel army fell into chaos. David didn't hesitate. Charge. The Karak warriors roared as they stormed the battlefield, using the confusion to their advantage. David fought alongside them, moving fast, striking hard. His human tactics gave them the edge. And for the first time, the Draxel hesitated. The turning point. As the battle raged on, David knew one thing. This was just the beginning. The Draxel were powerful, but tonight, they had learned something. Humans were not easy to defeat. David stood in the middle of the battlefield, breathing hard. Scifi ran up to him. The enemy is retreating. For now. David nodded. Then we prepare for the next fight. Varaka smiled. You are not just our warlord, David. You are our warrior. David looked at the battlefield, at his warriors, at the sky above. This was his war now, and he was ready for it. The battlefield was quiet now. Smoke rose from the wreckage of destroyed war machines. The Draxel had retreated, their forces broken, their pride wounded. But David Cole knew this was not the end. He stood on a rocky outcrop, overlooking the battlefield. The Karak warriors moved among the fallen, helping the wounded, gathering weapons, and securing prisoners. Varaka approached him, her armor scratched and her face smeared with dirt. We won the battle. David exhaled, running a hand through his hair. But not the war. Shaniri joined them, her expression serious. Scouts report that the Draksul are regrouping. They will return, stronger. David clenched his fists. He had expected this. The Draksul never accepted defeat easily. Kalatesh arrived, holding a damaged enemy communicator. We intercepted a message. The Draksul are calling for reinforcements. David's jaw tightened. How many? Kalatesh hesitated. A full invasion force. The city prepares. The warriors return to the city, carrying their wounded, their dead, and their hard-won victory. The people cheered when they saw David and the warband, but he could see the fear in their eyes. They knew this was not over. David stood on the fortress balcony, looking down at the gathered crowd. He had been their warlord for only a short time, yet now their survival depended on him. Shaniri placed a hand on his shoulder. They need hope. David nodded and stepped forward. His voice rang out across the courtyard. We fought. We won. But the enemy is not finished. They come again, thinking they can break us. He paused, letting his words sink in. But they forget one thing. We do not break. The crowd roared in approval. We will fight. We will defend our homes. And we will show them that the Karak and their warlord will never fall. The city erupted in cheers. The warriors beat their weapons against their shields. Varaka grinned. Now we fight for survival. The strategy. That night, David gathered his closest advisors in the war room. A large map was spread across the table, showing the terrain, the city, and the possible paths the enemy could take. David pointed to the narrow valley leading to the city. They will come through here. It is the fastest route. Kalatesh nodded. But they will bring more machines, more soldiers. David's eyes gleamed. Then we changed the battlefield again. He traced his finger along the valley. We collapse this passage when they enter. Trap them between the mountains. Then we hit them from above, from the cliffs. Varaka grinned. A death trap. Shaniri, however, looked concerned. And if it fails? David looked at her. Then we fight in the streets. Every building, every alley, every corner. We make them bleed for every step they take. The Karak warriors nodded. They had defended their city before. They would do it again. David turned to the others. Get the people ready. Move supplies, strengthen the walls, prepare the warriors. We have little time. The calm before the storm. The next day, the city was alive with preparation. Warriors trained harder, blacksmiths worked day and night, and scouts patrolled the borders. David stood on the fortress walls, watching the horizon. He could feel it. The storm was coming. Varaka walked up beside him. You're thinking too much. David smirked. I'm planning. She crossed her arms. And if the plan fails? David chuckled. Then we make a new one. Varaka smiled. Good answer. Suddenly, a scout ran up to them, out of breath. They are coming. David's expression hardened. How long? The scout swallowed. By sunrise. David nodded. Then this is it. He turned to Varaka. Get everyone to their positions. We fight at dawn. The enemy returns. As the first light of day touched the sky, the ground trembled. The Draksul had arrived. David stood atop the fortress, looking down at the massive army below. Rows of soldiers, heavy war machines, and dark, hovering drones filled the valley. The enemy had doubled their forces. A deep, booming voice echoed across the battlefield. Human warlord, you delay the inevitable. Surrender now, and we will spare your people. David smirked. Inevitable. Funny. That's what the last guy said. The Draksul commander growled. Then you choose death. David raised his hand. Fire. The mountains roared as explosives detonated. The valley walls cracked, sending massive rock slides crashing down onto the enemy. The Draxel lines shattered. From above, Carrack archers rained down fire. Warriors hidden in the cliffs launched surprise attacks. The enemy was caught in chaos. David turned to his warriors. Now we finish this. The Carrack warriors roared as they charged into battle. The final battle. The valley became a battlefield of fire and steel. The Draxel fought fiercely, but David and his warriors fought harder. David moved through the chaos, dodging enemy attacks, taking down soldiers with precise strikes. His training, his strategy, and his instincts guided him. Veraka fought beside him, her blades cutting through enemies like a storm. Kalatesh led a group of warriors, striking key targets, destroying war machines before they could fully activate. Shaniri coordinated the defenses, ensuring the city remained protected. The battle raged for hours. Then David saw him, the Draxel commander, standing on a broken war machine, barking orders. David's eyes narrowed. Time to end this. He fought his way through, his movements quick, efficient. When he reached the commander, the Draxel turned, snarling. "You should have surrendered." David smirked. "Not my style." The two clashed, their fight brutal and fast. The Draxel was strong, but David was smarter. He dodged a powerful strike and countered, using the enemy's own momentum against him. With one final blow, the Draxel commander fell. The remaining enemy forces hesitated. Without their leader, their will to fight crumbled. They began to retreat. The Carrack warriors roared in victory. The battle was won. Aftermath. As the sun set, the city stood strong. The people cheered for their warriors for their survival. David sat on the fortress steps, exhausted but satisfied. Shaniri sat beside him. "You have saved us." David sighed. "For now." Veraka grinned. "You're starting to sound like a warlord." David chuckled. "Maybe, but I'm just a human who refuses to lose." The war was over. For now. The battlefield was silent now. The smoke had cleared, and the last of the Draxel forces had fled. The Carrack warriors stood victorious, their weapons still in hand, their faces smeared with the marks of war. David Cole stood at the edge of the battlefield, his breathing steady, but his body aching from the long fight. He had never imagined himself as a warlord, leading an alien people into battle. But here he was, and against all odds, he had won. Veraka walked up beside him, resting her blade on her shoulder. They ran faster than I expected. David smirked. Bullies always do when they realize they can't win. Shaniri approached, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon. "We will need to confirm their retreat. The Draxel do not surrender easily." David nodded. "Send scouts. If they come back, I want to know before they reach our borders." Kalatesh arrived, leading a group of warriors carrying the injured back to the city. "The wounded are being treated. We lost many, but our people still stand." David clenched his fists. Every warrior lost was a heavy burden, but at least they had protected their home. Veraka placed a hand on his shoulder. "This victory is because of you." David sighed. "Not just me. All of us." The Carrack warriors raised their weapons in the air, shouting in victory. The sound echoed through the mountains. They had won. But now, they had to rebuild. Returning home. The march back to the city was long but filled with pride. The people had heard of their victory, and they lined the streets, cheering and celebrating. David watched as families reunited, warriors embraced their loved ones, and children ran alongside the returning soldiers, their eyes wide with admiration. As they entered the fortress, Shaniri turned to David. "There is one last thing we must do." David raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" She gestured toward the great hall. "The ceremony." David sighed. "Another tradition." Veraka smirked. "You are our warlord, David. You must officially claim the title." David groaned. "I thought winning the war was enough." Kalatesh chuckled. "Not for the Karak." The warlord's oath. That evening, the great hall was filled with warriors, elders, and leaders of the Karak people. Torches burned brightly, and banners of victory hung from the walls. David stood before the crowd, his hands resting on the ceremonial blade he had taken from Chathraga, the former warlord. An elder stepped forward, her wrinkled face filled with wisdom. "You fought with honor. You led our people to victory. Now, you must take the oath." David sighed but straightened his back. "All right, let's do this." The elder raised her hands. "Repeat after me." David followed her words. "I swear to protect this people. I swear to lead with wisdom and strength. I swear to fight for our future." The hall erupted in cheers as the elder placed a golden band on his arm. David Cole was now the true warlord of the Karak. A time for peace. Over the next few days, the city focused on rebuilding. The damaged walls were repaired, the injured were treated, and supplies were gathered for the coming winter. David spent his days ensuring the people were safe, but at night, he found himself on the fortress balcony, staring at the stars. Varaka found him there one evening. "You look lost in thought." David chuckled, just wondering what comes next. She leaned against the railing. "For now, peace, but one day, another enemy will come." David nodded. "And we'll be ready." She smiled. "You are not just our warlord, David. You are one of us now." David looked out at the city below. It wasn't just their home anymore. It was his home too. And he would fight for it. Always. The end, or the beginning. David had come to this world as a warrior. He had fought battles, earned respect, and become something greater than he ever expected. But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning of his story. Because humanity never stops fighting, and neither would he. Thank you for reading.